Alrighty. We are continuing in a series called The Story, taking the Bible in chronological time. And in the storybooks that our guys have is chapter 9. But we're going to be looking at an unlikely book in the Bible that just seems to be inserted right in the middle of all God's plans. Now that we've got some young people here, I can say that you probably looked on YouTube at a lot of videos that are crazy. One that was floating around some time ago was a kid opening up a birthday present. And he's clearly anticipating something. He knows this is going to be the greatest birthday present ever. And there's this look on his face, anticipation, excitement, and joy. And he wraps the paper to shreds. And then the look of excitement changes to confusion as he looks in the box. As he looks at the box. He was hoping for an Xbox. But now he's staring at a box that simply says, "Make pottery at home, fun with the family." How could this happen? He's wondering, did you not understand what I wanted? And he's completely irritated at his parents that they did not get him the present that he asked. And he's got this confused look, and it turns into anger, and he throws the box across the floor. He says, "You never get anything I want." And he runs out and stomps out of the room. Hold that story until the end of the sermon, okay? We're going to circle back to that. We deal with disappointment all the time. There is no way our life is perfect. And sometimes disappointment comes in the most unexpected way. But there's one thing adults have learned, well, okay, disappointment's going to come. I got to learn how to handle this. And when it comes to presents, we get better at disguising that. When Dad gets an old ugly tie, he's going to wear it because his kids gave it to him. But sometimes it just happens. Now, to understand that video, try to imagine a wife asked her husband for a present. She said, "I want a pair of shoes. This is the color of the shoes I want. This is the style of the shoes I want. And this is the size of the shoes I want." And she knows she's going to get those shoes. And when she opens up the package, it's a box of Nutrisystem food. You know, like, did I not get what you wanted? Or if husband says, "I want an iPhone," and he opens up and it's a pair of nose clippers. You know, that's what's going on in this video here. So we know what it's like to have those moments. We kind of swallow it, and we find ourselves, I cannot believe I got that kind of a present at this time. So life happens that way. We graduate from school, and we say, "This is my plan, this is my career," and something comes along and stops that. We get married, and we think, "This is the person of my dreams," and they're like, "Wait a minute, I didn't know you like country music. I don't like country music, I want rap music." And we always get something we don't expect. So that's sort of the situation that we're in with Ruth. The book of Ruth, right in the middle of the Old Testament. And if there's a video camera rolling in this story, it's an expression of joy and excitement. But there's also anger and disillusionment. Now, when you read the book of Ruth, the question's got to pop in your head. Why is this book here? I want you to hold on to that thought through the sermon, because at the end of this, I'm going to connect some dots that maybe you've never connected before. This comes at the time during the Judges. We talked about Judges last week. Well, this book is not about the nation of Israel. You look at it, and this is about a family who has no prominence. They're not an Abraham. They're not a Noah. It's just a family that's going through some tough times. So as we look through that, what's the answer? It's a story about a husband named Elimelech and his wife named Naomi. We don't have a picture of Naomi, but we do know what her name means. Naomi means sweet or pleasant. And that's how she was known. A very sweet and pleasant woman. And so at one point in the book of Ruth describes Naomi as just being full and satisfied. Wouldn't you love to have that described about your life? I'm just full and satisfied. My life is just great here. And I'm sure that's how it felt on her wedding day. Her husband are standing together and committing their lives to each other. Excitement, anticipation, and things look like it's going according to plan. And then they have 2 sons. This is great. We got married. We married the person we wanted to marry. We've got 2 sons. But then we pick up their storyline later, and everything about joy changes to disillusionment. Because now there's a famine in the land. A famine that is so severe they can't stay there anymore. Now, you and I can't hardly identify with that. The closest we can identify that is the pictures that we're seeing in Ukraine right now. People having to leave their homeland. They're at a desolate point. They can't say that. Can you imagine being at that point where a country invades us and everything is desolate, is destroyed, and we say, we can't stay anymore. We've got to be refugees to another country. There's not a war going on, but there's a famine. And so it's sort of like if devastation hits us would be like coming home after a 20-year career and saying, they cut me loose today. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how to do anything else. I've been at this job my whole life, and you're wondering, what are we going to do? How are we going to feed the family? How are we going to pay the bills? I don't know if we keep this house. But we got to put food in our children's stomach here. But that's what's happening right here. Naomi and her husband, we got to move. We can't stay here. We have to go to a land that has food. And that's when they go to a land called Moab. So Elimelech and Naomi go to a land called Moab. It's not that far. They say, we'll get a fresh start. Let's go to a new land and we'll start all over. Now, try to understand that Naomi is in the promised land. You remember how we talked about the children of Israel broke down the walls of Jericho? They're in Canaan. They're in the promised land. They're given a piece of land that's their heritage. And they're having to leave that. That land was going to be passed down from generation to generation. And they're having to leave that. So they're going to Moab. What's the problem with Moab? Because Moab has the descendants of Sodom, which is a pagan culture. They have a lot of prejudice towards the Israelites. They are sworn enemies of God, and so they go to this hostile country that hates them. But they got to, because they need a place to eat. They've heard that the ground is more fertile, and Naomi's thinking, I've lost everything. I can't believe it, but I got my husband. He's a good man. He takes care of me. I've got my 2 boys. They're healthy and they're strong. Hey, and I've got my faith. Everything's going to be okay. But they get to Moab, and something happens. Her husband gets sick. He doesn't get better. He becomes weaker, and he dies. So here's Naomi, a single mom, a widow, in a hostile country, trying to raise 2 boys. So the boy said, Mom, we got this. So they find 2 Moabite women. Remember, pagan women. Pagan women there who do not believe in God. And their names are Orpah and Ruth. Orpah and Ruth. They get married. Everything seems great. But right after they get married, the 2 sons die. Can you imagine what Naomi's thinking? What's going on here? Can anything happen that's worse than this? And so she's just experiencing this incredible feeling of grief. A man by the name of Edgar Jackson wrote about grief like this. Here's what he says about grief. Grief is a silent, knife-like terror and sadness that comes 100 times a day when you start to speak to someone that's no longer there. Grief is the emptiness when you eat alone after eating with another for many years. Grief is teaching yourself to go to bed without saying goodnight to the one who has died. Grief is the helpless wishing that things were different when you know they're not, and they never will be. Sometimes disappointment comes, loss comes, and none of us are exempt from that. Sometimes we anticipate it, sometimes it comes so unexpectedly. And that's what Naomi seems to be experiencing right here. Just an inordinate amount of loss. Her husband, her land, her home, and now her children. Let me tell you the story about Millie. Millie is a widow who was married to her husband for 51 years. After he passed, she didn't think that she would find love again, but she did. 5 years after her husband's passing, she was engaged to be married, and her fiance passed away 2 days before their wedding. Here's what she shared with her pastor. I know there's other people that feel what I feel. I know there's other people out there that are hurting. I know we all have friends, and they're well-meaning, and perhaps a church that says, it's going to be okay. With time, it'll get better. So instead of dealing with it that way, she wrote some poetry. She said, if there's others going through this, maybe they won't feel alone. Maybe they'll understand how I'm feeling and know that it's not normal. And so she wrote a poem that is simply entitled, Broken. Here's the way that poem goes. Do you see that pile of wood chips on the floor? That's what I had of my life before. When I was loved by you with all your heart, when passion awoke and played its part, our oneness in purpose and agreement and thought, is not something that could be bartered or bought. It seemed to be perfect, to even have heaven's blessings. Each word, each gaze, and touch was a form of caressing. I'd never known such love from you before. Now all that remains is a bunch of chips on the floor. It looks to others like I'm doing all right, but they don't see that wood chip of crying all night. My friends and my families, they think I'm doing okay, but that wood chip is hidden in my struggle every day. So many chips in that pile on the floor: emptiness, loneliness, disappointment, and more. Dreams unfulfilled, plans hung in midair, love uncompleted, beckons imaging so rare. My life has been broken, nothing fits anymore, because there's this big pile of wood chips in the middle of my floor. That's how Naomi felt. She's just looking at all the chips from her life and said, how did I get here? I'm pleasant, I'm sweet, I'm full. And now all of a sudden, she didn't feel like she has any choice. I got to leave Moab and I got to go back home. And she tells her two daughters-in-law, remember, two sons have died, Ruth and Orpah. She said, look, you're young women. Stay here. Get remarried. Raise a family. I need to go back home. Orpah agrees to stay. But Ruth, her daughter-in-law, refuses to stay. And Ruth says to her in chapter 1, verse 16, she says this to her mother-in-law, and it should be on your handout. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So this is the daughter-in-law saying this to the mother-in-law. Now you've heard that text before. And you know where you heard it? At a wedding, right? Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. However, in context, it doesn't fit, because the bride is looking at the groom. I'll go where you go. I'll stay where you stay. Your God will be my God. Actually, what should happen is the bride should turn to the future mother-in-law. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. I don't think that tradition's going to work, do you? But that's in the context of the story right here. But that's what's going on. It's a special relationship that is formed between Naomi and Ruth. And the Bible says, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So they make this journey back to Naomi's hometown. Guess where Naomi's hometown is? A little town called Bethlehem. Ring a bell? You're getting ready to find out why Ruth's in the Bible here. We start to get some indication here because Bethlehem is this town of less than 200 people. The reason that's significant is because everybody knows Naomi's back. Hey, is this her? Doesn't look like her. She looked a lot happier when she left. And they can't believe it, but here's what Naomi says. Don't call me that name anymore, because God has made my life bitter, not sweet. And here's what Naomi says. The Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Can you see the expression on her face? She's angry. She's bitter because this is not the way my story was supposed to go. And she's pretty much saying, God made my life bitter. And we can understand that sometimes. Sometimes we identify with that. Well, okay, I'm getting to the point of the story now. This is about loss. This is about loss and somebody who's lost her home, her land, her husband, and her sons. But does the story have to be about loss? She loses a lot, incredible pain and loss, but doesn't have to be about loss. There was an interview some time ago on a radio by a gentleman by the name of Gerald Sitzer. He was a professor at Whitmore College in Spokane, Washington. A number of years ago, he was in a bad car accident, hit by a drunk driver in their minivan. He lost 3 generations in that accident. He lost his mom, he lost his wife, and he lost his daughter. But he survived without a scratch. And in the interview, he just wanted to talk about what it was like. And so he wrote a book about that experience. And the name of the book is called A Grace Disguised. I like the name of that. And here's what he says about his loss. The experience of loss does not need to be the defining moment of my story. The experience of loss does not need to be the defining moment of our story. Now, it's one thing for me to say that. I've experienced some loss, but I haven't experienced a 3-generation loss. So we don't get to decide the roles we play in our story of our lives, but we do get to decide how we react. And sometimes at the point of your story, you just have to say, you know what? Is this going to define me? Is this the way I'm going to go? Naomi here is like, she could have got caught up in the pain of her little story. But she said, don't call me sweet. Call me bitter. I left full, but I've come back empty. Now, here's what we're going to see in the story of Naomi. If there's one word to describe it, it's not loss, it's redemption. Catch that. Right in the middle of this story about loss, it's the story of redemption. She could have just wiped away her tears, but she couldn't do that at the time. But what God's doing with Naomi, he's picking up those wood chips on the floor. He said, do you see the wood chips? Loss, disappointment, bitterness. Can you just look at this real quickly and watch what I'm going to do? So what God does in the life of Naomi, he redeems her story of loss with an unlikely friendship, being Ruth. Now remember what she told Ruth. Stay here. I've lost everything. We do that sometimes when we go through loss. We push people away. And who would have guessed that her daughter-in-law from Moab would have been the one that she had a close connection with? In fact, later in the text, when the village gets to know Ruth, even though she's from Moab, in chapter 4, verse 15, they tell her, say, Naomi, your daughter-in-law Ruth is better than 7 sons. She is a jewel. They just fall in love with Ruth. So this friendship now helps to redeem her story. So Ruth, now Naomi has to look at this and think, she's telling me this is going to be okay. And I don't know if you've ever ridden on a plane with somebody that's never ridden on a plane, and you get a little turbulence. They look at you and say, please tell me this is going to be okay. Some people need that assurance. Well, that's what we need sometimes. Somebody just needs to grab a hold of our arm and say, you know what? I don't even understand what you're feeling, but I know it's going to be okay. The reason I know that is because that's what the church does. That's when the church is its best. I've sat in homes of tragedy, and they look at me with 1,000 questions. Rick, I don't understand this. And I always say the same answer. This is when the church is its best. Let the church be the church right now. Let us offer you comfort. Let us be here for you. Not provide all the answers, but let us be here for you. So now God he redeems this loss through an unlikely relationship. And Ruth is basically telling Naomi, it's going to be okay. And he redeems that loss through the undeserved kindness of a man by the name of Boaz. Put that mental thought in your head. Now, that might seem weird to our culture. Boaz comes in and buys the property, but that was culturally appropriate. Y'all are widows, y'all are devastated. I'm going to buy your land, and I'm going to take care of Ruth. Now, remember the promised land was set up where they got their piece of land, and if the heir died, it would fall to the closest relative to redeem that loss. That's what Boaz does. He comes in and buys the property and promises to take care of Ruth. Now remember, this is no small act of kindness because Ruth's a Moabite. She's a pagan. And Boaz shows her kindness. He goes out of her way. Here's the kicker. Are you ready for this? We're coming back to that beginning of the sermon here. It turns out you and I know the mother of Boaz. Anybody know the mother of Boaz? Her name was Rahab. Rahab was the prostitute that was working on the inside of the walls of Jericho that helped the spies get in. So Rahab has a son by the name of Boaz. Boaz grew up to be a man who honored God in every way. And God honored him in such a way that he had all these means to shower his fortune on those unfortunate. And then God provides the unpredictable ending here. The story of Ruth ends with a genealogy. You remember how Matthew begins with a genealogy? We read that Boaz and Ruth gave birth to a son named Obed. You remember Obed? Bet you don't. But Obed gave birth to a son named Jesse. Jesse gave birth to a son named David, who was King David. This started with a prostitute at the walls of Jericho. And you read through the genealogy and you think, wait a minute, I've heard this before. Go to Matthew chapter 1, and there's that genealogy. Ruth chapter 4 ends with David. Matthew chapter 1 begins the same way. It points to Jesus as the Redeemer. That's why the book's there. That's why that book, who would have guessed that God was taking all those chips from the floor and he was putting them all together? Bitterness, loss, devastation. I get it. But let me work out my plan, because I got a plan. And he'd already started the plan, and Naomi didn't have a clue. Ruth didn't have a clue. He was taking all those pieces of chips and turning them into something beautiful. Let's go back to the video. Boy that opened up the pottery box, got upset, threw the box across the floor, stomped out. You got to watch the end of the video, because Mom comes back and picks up the box. She said, son, you got to open the box. I don't want a pottery kit. But that's the only box I had. Open the box. He opens the box, and there's the next box, full of games. She said, I couldn't fit it all in one bag. So I used that box. I was just trying to get it all together. You got to open the box. So that's what happens. God gives us something and says, I don't want that. That's not what I ordered. I don't want that at all. But before we stomp out of the room and slam the door, take time to open the box. God says, look at those chips. Look at those wood chips there. It may not be something audible, like a voice to Abraham and Moses. You might not have an ark like Noah. You might not have a God closing the mouths of lions. But every time there's a story in the Bible, God's working an upper story in our lower story and working it out. Every time something feels broken, God's at work. So when you open the box and it says cancer, terminated, death, God says, open the box. I got some wood chips in there. Let me put the wood chips together, and your story does not have to be the closing story. Let me work out my story. That's when God does his best work. He picks up those wood chips that look broken and says, I'm going to put them together into a beautiful masterpiece. That is when God is at his best. Pray with me. God, I'm so glad that you pick up our pieces of our life. Even though we have what in our minds are a perfect plan, sometimes it gets broken. And God, I thank you that in the end our story is good. Our story is perfect. And I just ask, Father, that you give us the courage, give us the trust to open up the box and look at all the chips you're putting together. I thank you, Father, for churches across this land that people can go to, be a part of, and that we can reach out and put our arms out to them and say, it's going to be okay. I don't have the answer now, but it is going to be okay, because you have proven that. And I thank you for the story of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and how you picked up all those chips and turned it into a beautiful, beautiful story. Father, thank you for perfection that you give us every day in our imperfection. We love you, and we come to you always through the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, we're going to close with our chorus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. If you don't know that, it's 155. But I think most everybody knows that song. Let's close with that. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Thank you. I remind everybody next Saturday, the River Club